Now, for most of naval history, for most of the history of navies as we work with, we don't know the exact timing of things evolving. We don't know when things come about, when things actually become the case, especially not on a theoretical level. We tend to date these creations of things to when the first ship is laid down, which is built in that mold, because that is something tangible we, as historians, can point to. We can say, that came about then, and I can tell you it came about then, because look, there's a lump of steel, or iron, or wood in that required shape. But there are a few things in history where I can point to a public discourse. There are a few points in history where you can go, ding ding, that's the moment which the ideas come together. And that's when they come together publicly. They start to permeate the media. They start to be part of the global debate on naval security and the future of navies. And we can do this with heavy AA cruisers. We can point to this in 1927. We can literally point to this in 1927 and go, well, there's an article, don't you know? Now, there is a problem with this, though, because even if I'm pointing to that article and going, that's where dedicated AA cruisers come about, I'm also not being fully truthful. Because the honest debate towards the end of World War I, and especially post-World War I when there's something up, is that aircraft are coming. They are a coming threat. We're going to need to be able to deal with them. They aren't a threat now. They might not be a threat in the immediate future, but they are coming. We all know they're coming. But they're not a threat now. There is a reason why the first generation of County-class cruisers can all elevate their 8-inch guns to 70 degrees. It's not because the Royal Navy really wanted to do the highball shot and was having visions of scoring slam dunks with 8-inch shells. It's because they thought maybe an 8-inch high explosive round would be a nasty surprise for any aircraft trying to do a flyby. And so, this is the thing. I can point to the thing in 1927. I can point to the article, and I will show you where the article is. And there will hopefully be a link down below if I remember to put it in. If I forget, badger me. Tell me off. Aggressively remind me if I've forgotten to put the link in. It's on the USNI website, so you couldn't go find it there. But do remind me to stick the link in, because I said I was going to. And the reality is, whilst I can point to this thing, I know the debate was going on around it. This is just the first time it's public. And honestly, there is a slight bias towards English-speaking sources, but there is also a slight bias to the fact that the English-speaking sources tend to be from the nations which are building the most cruisers at these points, and are therefore having the widest debates of this. So there is sometimes when I see the critique of going, well, that's according to English-speaking sources. No, this person had this idea maybe at this point, if you translate their wording and the meaning this way and that way. And you go, well, yes, there was a lot of navies considering this, a lot of navies working this. But there are very few navies who actually build them. In fact, for heavy AA cruisers, there are 2 navies who build them. Prior to World War II and during World War II, 2. So, realistically, the ones we have to watch are the people who are going to build them. The others might consider it, and there is a certain argument with a certain Italian light cruiser. There is a bit of an argument about them, and they are gorgeous vessels, but they are destroyer leaders and meant for the Mediterranean conflict more than they are. They have an AA capability, but it is not their purpose. Whereas the Atlantas, whilst theoretically built as destroyer leaders, it's very hard to argue that with their plethora of 5-inch and the way they are fitted and positioned in task forces, that they are not the heavy AA cruiser when they're there. Because again, the interesting thing is, the US Navy doesn't usually have a lot of them available at a time, and for a Navy which finds itself fighting as many carrier air battles and battles of attrition at sea as it does, you'd think a heavy AA cruiser would be a viable option. It would be something they'd like, but there are reasons. We'll get into this. We'll get into all the discussion of this, because ultimately, the problem with an AA cruiser is differentiation. And it's one of the reasons why they die out quite so quickly post-World War II, because you, of course, have the 6-inch guns, or the Tiger class with their 3-inch guns, the 6-inch guns, and things like that, which are automatic and are capable of AA engagement because they can now move faster, load faster, and so you're using a 6-inch gun, which is a traditional cruiser weapon system. So it's just a cruiser. The fact that its weapons are very good at their heavy AA work is neither here nor there. It's just a normal cruiser. That's what we like to fool ourselves into believing. It's actually that heavy AA work is now a standard part of a cruiser's role. So there's no separate cruisers because they are the cruisers. But that is something to be discussed at the end of Build Up to. Let's go back to their beginning. Let's go back to, well, as said, there is a paper in 1927 which I can point to, which is Cruisers and Their Roles, by, well, cruiser types, by Franklin G. Percival. But he better enunciates this in his 1931 paper, which I have featured here, but I'll have links to both down below, which is entitled, if I can find the correct paper in my notes, because I put all his papers together in a Word file labeled Franklin Percival, because that made sense to the historian I was at the time when I was saving these things. It's not sensible now. In April 1931, called Elements Contributing to Aerial Superiority. And in the summary, and I do mean in the summary, this is literally the final 7 points at the end, and I'll expand it so you can see it, and you can go and get this, well, you can see there's a little sort of page details on here from the US Naval Institute, and it's worthwhile going and seeing. It's one of my, you get a certain number of free articles a month you can go and see for free and download, and they're worthwhile having. There is a tendency to think of aerial superiority almost entirely in terms of aircraft strength, and to ignore the equally important element of anti-aircraft strength. Aircraft strength should be augmented by building up to the treaty limits of carrier tonnage, and by developing our merchant marine, rather than by building hybrid types or by overloading existing gun vessels with airplanes. Please note, escort carrier idea coming along here. Rapid conversion of merchant ships for aerial roles. Oh yes, it's not just the British considering this in the 1920s and 30s, it's also the Americans and the Japanese, of course. They're all working at it, it's just it takes time to actually deliver it, because it's getting governments to fund it. A fleet lacking in anti-aircraft strength will inevitably be driven out of the air by a fleet of equal strength which has developed an adequate gun defense against aircraft. If two fleets equally lacking in anti-aircraft strength should meet, the result should be decided by chance. A fleet lacking in anti-aircraft strength cannot take the offensive against even a much weaker fleet. The building up of our anti-aircraft strength is therefore vital to our security. Anti-aircraft strength may be augmented by the development of suitable weapons, instruments, types of ships, and tactics. Except for building a fleet flagship and possibly a relief flagship, we should utilize our unexpended balance of cruiser tonnage for types calculated to add to the anti-aircraft strength of our fleet rather than to its aircraft strength. Our Navy is not prepared to meet the situation which would confront it if war should break out tomorrow, in that individual ships and the fleet as a whole are lacking in anti-aircraft strength, in that some current tactical ideas need modernization, and in that we lack the greatly improved types of aircraft, submarines and listing devices needed for the service of information and security. The production in the shortest possible time of the enormous amount of material required is a vital problem. Turn those problems over to commercial concerns, offering either cash prizes or substantial contracts and incentives, has produced consistently excellent results. The Navy Department will have all that it can do in solving those problems which cannot be solved elsewhere. The way out of our difficulty lies, therefore, in the maximum utilization of private enterprise and individual genius. Well, there you go. And that's from usni.org/magazines /proceedings /1931 /April /elements contributing aerial superiority. Elements contributing to aerial superiority. I'm still not quite sure why he decided to spell it Francophile style, but we'll leave that to one side. Franklin Percival is probably the most British-sounding, affected, European affecting in his stylings naval officer I have ever read from that period. He's an excellent officer, please don't get me wrong, he is an excellent brain, and he really does provide some very interesting ideas. But the man goes out of his way sometimes to fancy up his language, let's say. He really does. He's a good guy, though. He does seem to be believing that what he does for the US Navy matters, what the US Navy needs matters. And I can't fault him for that. I really can't. Now, in contrast, I can also point to the starting point of the Didos. And that's slightly different than what Percival's outlining. It is slightly different than what Percival's outlining. And it comes from ADM 1.9427. And why am I doing these discussions and talking about these theories? Because if we don't understand where the theories are these ships coming from before we get to them, we can then evaluate them fairly. The smaller Dido class have been designed for a very different function. In a well-balanced fleet, it is very desirable to have a type of ship for reconnaissance work and in low visibility or at night, for screening the battle fleet from destroyer attack at night, and for support of our own flotillas during action. This type has a function in tactical plan of a battle which results from experience. Exhaustive trials have been made in the past to test out the various type of cruiser in day and night action. And the large type of cruiser is unsuitable on account of her large silhouette, and unnecessarily expensive for TIS function. I.e., we don't want to risk that amount of money doing this kind of job. The Dido class have all the qualities necessary for this fleet work. It's not necessary for them to carry sufficient armament to fight an enemy heavy cruiser. Simultaneously, with the decision to build this small fleet type of cruiser, the combined high-angle and low-angle 5.25-inch gun was perfected, and this provided a valuable opportunity of not only giving the small cruisers a low-angle armament of sufficient power for their function, but also a powerful high-angle armament to supplement the high-angle fire of the fleet, both at sea and in harbour. This is a screening cruiser. It's a screening cruiser. It's a fleet cruiser. It's not built to necessarily operate solo. It's built to operate as part of a wider fleet, i.e. maybe acting in the leadership role of the destroyer flotillas and acting in sort of command role for that. And also in terms of screening the Royal Navy's fleets from enemy destroyer attack and enemy air attack. It's screening against the lighter threats. It's there to protect the fleet and stand between it and harm, and hopefully deal with it with high-powered but faster-firing, lower-caliber guns. As in 5.25-inch, not 6-inch, not 8-inch. Now, the interesting thing here, I would point out, is the 5.25-inch gun and the anti-surface role that it has been selected for. Because having that screening role, both against enemy surface vessels, lighter surface vessels, destroyers, torpedo boats, and aircraft, has driven the desire for the firepower. Honestly, if the Royal Navy wanted to build a heavy AA cruiser, they could have just gone with a 4.5-inch. They've got a BD mount fixed up for that, and honestly, for a cruiser, a BD mount would fit with a cruiser. You can modify a BD mount's turret BD mount that's between decks, something which penetrates deck, rather than a UD mount, which is an upper deck one you tend to fit on destroyers, for a cruiser easily. In fact, most cruisers do carry BD mount systems, so that's what a Didos are built around. And honestly, that would also deal with top weight issues. You've also got the 4-inch, and honestly, if you'd been just focusing on dealing with destroyers, you'd probably have gone with a 5.5-inch. But they go to 5.25-inch. Why? Well, 5-inch and below is felt to be a destroyer caliber weapon, and this is a cruiser, and they want it to be a cruiser. So that means anything below 5 inches or below is not acceptable as its primary armament. It's just not. In Royal Navy terms, they are not building a cruiser which is a trumped-up destroyer. They might build what I would call cruiser-built destroyers, as in the Tribal-class destroyers, which are built on cruiser sort of cruiser ideas of layout in terms of their guns and armament, but they are destroyers. And the Didos might well be what I tend to call destroyer-built cruisers, in that they have guns crammed in every single inch to give them the maximum firepower, and their gunnery is orientated around speed of fire more than rather than penetration or capability of dealing with ships. You know, there's a whole debate of 6-inch versus 8-inch, where basically it's effective combat ranges. And 6-inch provides you with, especially in visual combat era and the visual combat period before you have radar guided gunnery, it provides you with more shells and more, therefore more explosive, hitting the enemy at, being fired at the enemy at crucial engagement ranges. So at your likely engagement range, when you're effectively likely to effectively be engaging the enemy, which is actually not that dissimilar between the 6-inch and the 8-inch gun. It's not that dissimilar. Maximum ranges are dissimilar, but effective gunnery ranges in the visual gunnery area are not that dissimilar. You'll be putting a lot more explosive down on your opponent with a 6-inch gun. And with 6-inch turrets, because the rate of fire. And that means that you are more likely to get a mission kill. And once you've blinded a ship, once you've damaged its bridge, once you damage its fire control, etc., you can close and kill it with torpedoes if you have to. It's still dead. But the thing is, the 6-inch is an anti-cruiser weapon. That's fine, but honestly, if you want to kill destroyers, if you want to kill small things, you need something that's faster firing than that. You need a faster moving turret than that. So that means you can't have a 6-inch. And that basically means your options are 5.5-inch. That's a little heavy. It's what's fitted on Hood and the Admirals originally, but that's a little heavy. 5.25-inch, that's a different thing. That works out as a fairly sweet spot. Because you can do a lot with around that size. It's just the square cube law just works enough in your favour in the 5.25 to give you a lot of advantages with 1930s technology for what you can put in that shell. And so there you go, there we have it. The Dido class. They're screening cruisers. And again, if we go back to this previous document and talk about a conception, the Americans have taught, Pierce has talked about an AA cruiser. He's the one who's brought the AA cruiser idea to purpose. But again, there's a reason I started off by talking about his cruiser paper. There is a reason. Because in that 1927 paper, he outlines the scout cruiser. Large, fast, heavily armed but scantily protected, suitable for scouting, commerce destruction, hunting enemy raiders, supporting destroyer attacks, breaking up enemy destroyer attacks, escorting light mine layers or motorboat carriers, screening aircraft carriers during engagement, or for raids in force on an enemy's protected lines of communication. The scout cruiser. He decides that's an unsound type and wants to convert that into a screening cruiser. by de facto, when you read through the document, that is the case he's making. He wants to keep the large cruisers, he wants to keep the larger destroyers, but honestly, he's trying to work out what the light cruiser role is. And pretty much it's coming into a screening cruiser, but the trouble is, he's not sure what it needs to screen against. And he talks about screening a lot. Screening is something which is a phraseology we have forgotten a lot when we talk about cruisers today, when we talk about warships today. We talk about the escort force, we talk about the strength of carrier battle group or a navy, its task force. We don't use the phrase screening. The idea of having ships which are literally supposed to screen off between the main fleet and the enemy forces attacking, light forces, aerial forces. We might think of them as pickets, but the whole point is a screening ship is more than a picket. It's not just meant out there as an alert, as a canary. No, it's meant to have a chance of actually blunting the attack heavily. But it's a very careful balance of a ship to build, because it's got to be just capable enough to be able to do that job, but not so capable it's so expensive you actually are worried about leaving it out there and worried about replacing it. And that's a balance. And that's what we're going to be discussing today, basically. We are discussing the Didos, we're discussing the Atlantas, and they are really, to my mind, far more the Anglo and the American, or the British and the American approach to differing approaches to screening cruisers. The true anti-aircraft cruisers being the conversions of the Cs and the Ds, but we'll talk about them as well. The point is, and the question today will be, what would be a screening ship today if we were building one at the end? And please think about that while we're talking it through, because, well, I'll ask that question at the end, as I always ask questions at the end. But think about it as we're going through. Think about all we're discussing. Because I know the topic is supposed to be AA cruisers. But the thing is, whilst they've been popularly remembered as being anti-aircraft cruisers, they weren't anti-aircraft cruisers. They were screening cruisers. And as such, anti-aircraft was a critical role they would perform. But they would equally perform that role hoovering up enemy destroyers and motor torpedo boats and anything else of the enemy light forces that they found, because that is what they were supposed to kill. That is what they were supposed to do. Now, the Dido class came from the same design study which produced the Tribal class destroyers, and there's no surprise really, because both are built with an idea of serving on the A to K line, the scouting line of the Royal Navy, and also the screening line of the Royal Navy. It's important to get that straight, as that's said. It's the screening scouting line. The Royal Navy planned on having aircraft scout in front of the cruisers, especially when weather permitted. They did realise that the weather might not always be in their favour. They operated in the North Sea and the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, and they realised that some oceans were positively against them being able to operate aircraft at long range. Some oceans, some bodies of water, like the North Sea, have a habit of trying to nick aircraft. It causes you to develop a complex. There's an arguable reason the British stayed so attached for so long to centerline lifts on their aircraft carriers is because they lost so many aircraft during World War I to the sea going whoomp. It makes you touchy on the subject and rather, nuanced about it, but now we have deck-edge lifts on our new carriers, so it's fine. We've got over it. We just make sure we don't carry any aircraft on the deck when we're in the North Sea. Still. If we can avoid it. We really don't want them on the deck. Might be bigger carriers, but we don't. Anyway, the Didos are built as part of that formation, as built as part of that idea. And To me, there's a very clear viewing point for why they are built as a screening cruiser rather than necessarily an air defense cruiser, especially in the Royal Navy's variation of thinking about it. Because they've been built as an air defense cruiser, I have no doubt, rather than being built for 5 or as 5 turrets, they'd have been built for 6. They'd have had 2 of the 5.25-inch mounts mounted on wings, 1 on either side, and 2 turrets forward, 2 turrets aft, and be arranged so. The reason I say that is because that gives you the best balance for air defense. The Royal Navy had already been working out how to position firepower for air defense. But if you're asking the Royal Navy how you position a vessel for screening operations, well, you want to engage enemy destroyer flotillas as far out as you can, and hopefully they're in front of you, and hopefully that means you want to have 6 guns, so you can range in on them. 6 guns so you can range in on them. And the moment you're going for such a high gun, such a high position to have your turret to provide that firepower, that rules out wing turrets, especially if you're building something which is viable weight-wise to get on enough numbers within the treaty system. And that's the other important thing to remember about the Didos. They are designed 1936-37, they are ordered in 37, and they are laid down, for the most part, in 37. They are laid down in 1937. August for Naid and Bonaventure, September for Phoebe, October for Hermione, Eurus and Dido, and then it's April 1938 for Sirius, January 1939 for Cleopatra, April 1939 for Scylla, Charybdis November 1939, and Argonauts November 1939. And we have the Bellona subgroup, which are November 1939, December 1939, and March 1940 for Royalist, which is the last one to be laid down. But Black Prince and Bellona are both November, and Diadem and Spartan are both December. All these ships are laid down, are constructed prior to or during or at the very beginning of World War II. They are very much still a product of the treaty era, and a product of we have limited abilities to fit get our number of ships in. We have to get as many as we can. We have to get as much out of the tonnage as we can. There you go, that's your advantage. This is what these ships are providing. And again, ordering as many as they do, and let's be honest, before World War II begins, they have ordered, 9 of the first batch of 11, well before war begins, and the remaining 2 of the initial batch and 5 of the secondary batch, which takes the class up to a solid 16 vessels built. A solid 16 completed, of which 5 will be lost during the war. Well, they're being built to fill in the numbers. They're being built to give you that required strength, to give you that required formation capability for your fleet operations. They're supposed to, like the tribals, work with your destroyer formations, work with supporting them, which is why they carry torpedoes, like many British cruisers do. They also carry ASDIC, but they're not supposed to go off hunting submarines. It's just the Royal Navy has a legacy from World War I of Abaca, Cressy and Hogue. You lose 3 cruisers in one day, and you decide how you're going to approach the submarine threat. For the Royal Navy, it became a point of paranoia, so ASDIC's fitted, and Type 279 early warning radar. And the difference between the classes, well, Dido class are designed with 5 twin 5.25 inch. They never have enough of those in production. They never. That's one of the reasons why the Bologna class are dropped down to 4 twin. They get an extra quad pom-pom, which is nice. 6 twin 20mm, but they still retain the torpedoes. The 6 twin 20mm replace realistically the 4 twin 0.5 inch AA machine guns of the Vickers variety. And again, they fit. These ships are able to do 32.25 knots. They're able to do 4,850 nautical miles at 11 knots. These are not the vessels the Royal Navy is going to have going around hunting for things like surface raiders. That's the Town class, which can do 5,300 nautical miles at 13 knots. Please note that. They can do a longer distance at a higher speed. They're carrying a lot more fuel. That's what they are for. Although the speed of these ships, 32.25 knots, that turns up a lot in Royal Navy cruiser designations, to the point at which you almost start to worry about it. And again, it's 4 Admiralty free drum boilers. 4 free drum boilers, generating 62,000 shaft horsepower, 4 shafts, all the standards, all the standard points for Royal Navy cruisers. And they're good ships. They are. Their armour is pretty much, well, they have some. They do have some. A 3-inch belt, 1-inch deck armour, 2 inches around the magazines and 1 inch on the bulkhead. They were fair. Okay, they were not going to win any surface fights with that based on their armour capacity, but they had the firepower they needed. And most of those ships, by the time they went to war, had upgraded either their pom-pom mounts or their machine guns to 20mm. They had done the requirements they needed to improve them before they even got into service. Argonaut here is a good example. As built, she does have her 10 5.25 inch guns, and not all ships got them. But she has 4 single 20mm cannon instead of those machine guns. She still has her 2 quad pom-pom mounts and her 2 triple torpedo tubes. But, let's be honest, she's a slightly more rounded vessel, and she's also posted as having a range of a little over 1,300 nautical miles going at 13 knots. Now, I would say this range comes from one of her listed performances, and we do know in that performance she was not dry. She still had quite substantial supplies of fuel left. Okay, she wasn't full, she had to be filled up. But from the description, you would get the impression that she was down to roughly 20% of her reserves. Now, to my mind, if I'm going to be conservative and say it's not 20%, say it's 10%, say she's down to 10%, she's done roughly 1,350 nautical miles, so that's roughly 150 nautical miles per 10%. So roughly her range at all 30 knots would be 1,500 nautical miles. And that would certainly fit with some of the ranges she posts at 16 knots. Again, these things are discussed in various books. It's always interesting to put in the actual performance of ships versus their designed official performance. Now, I would say again, this is probably because, rather like with certain aircraft carriers, where some spaces which were officially supposed to be left empty or otherwise used in the design when they were posting the standard design, in wartime turned out to be very useful as extra fuel tanks, and turned out to be very quickly able to be refitted as fuel tanks, or just maybe activated as fuel tanks, depending on which sources you're reading and who you're talking with. But again, is that unsurprising? The Navy, everyone was doing it. As I've often discussed, the naval treaties were treaties more in whether we could look like we're obeying for everyone, rather than whether they actually anyone was obeying. The Dido class contrasts quite interestingly with the Atlantas, though. Now, the Atlanta class are ordered in 1940. They are ordered later. They are laid down later. They are built to a far more of an air defense design, in that they are built with 8 twin 5-inch mounts, of which they'd have 3 forward, 3 aft, and 2 waist guns. The thing is, though, of the class, they comprise 2 out of the 3 light cruisers lost by the US Navy during World War II. And they are usually lost in the surface actions. They are built as scout cruisers. They are far closer to a scout cruiser, a screening cruiser idea than they are anything else. But the problem for them ultimately is this. They are carrying the same weapon system, the same 5-inch 38 that you can find on the destroyers. And when you consider the hordes of Fletchers and other destroyers coming out, they have a terrible time trying to justify their existence. If we think about the Didos in contrast, they have 5.25-inch guns. There is clear water. There is clear water between them and the 4.7s and 4.5s that the Royal Navy is fitting to its destroyers. There is a clear differential. They are clearly more powerful than destroyers. They are clearly have a justification, a slot in their line. But these are in many ways built as large destroyers, as large scouting destroyers. And that causes them a problem, because they're cruisers. So they're engaged by cruiser opponents, and the 5-inch 38 is not an anti-surface weapon. It is not, in terms of a cruiser-level anti-surface weapon. For destroyers engaging other destroyers, for destroyers smattering their opponents that are trying to get close with the torpedoes, they're fine. For a cruiser, they're not. And that then brings us also things like their belt armor, because they've got a 1-inch belt. The Didos have a 3-inch belt. So a lot of decisions were made about them, with ideas of the early war assessment and the American assessment, but of what they needed from warfare. They have gone for a far more gun-heavy approach. They've gone for 16 5-inch 38 compared to the British 10 5.25s. They've gone for waist armor. They've got all things maximised around the offensive armament firepower, around the gunnery firepower of the ship. And that fits with what the Americans were really thinking about them for, because yes, they are the American screening cruisers, but they are built very much to work with their destroyers. They're built very much to work with their destroyer flotillas and basically be a command destroyer, basically be the large destroyer with their formations, and occasionally providing heavy screening for carrier groups and other operations where they were going into areas where there was going to be significant enemy aviation presence. They are definitely a capability that is needed, but the thing is, it's a capability which is only really needed in a niche point when the Americans do not have the surge of destroyers coming in, because they have nothing to differentiate them from the destroyers. If we consider the rough costs of them and their capabilities, yes, they are designed around the Pacific operations and American fleet operations, with 8,500 nautical miles at 15 knots being their speed of movement, their top speed being 32.5, 33.6 knots, depending on the formation, and they have their high pressure boilers. They're also, believe it or not, and this is something that honestly I find quite confusing at some points when you consider their build and consider what they're built as, they are actually heavier in standard displacement than a Dido, but lighter in full load displacement. Heavier in standard displacement, lighter in full load displacement. And this shows the sheer amount of work needed to be put into their hull to get all this firepower put together, to get all these things organised and, working properly. It gives them a capability, truly. But it also puts them in a situation where you've got something which is a very complicated build, which is a very a niche build, and it's a niche build which in many ways is a duplication of effort of your destroyer forces, because they aren't differentiated enough from the destroyers. So this to me explains why, in contrast, there are only 8 of these vessels completed. There are only 8 completed. And there are only 8 ever ordered. Half the amount of the Didos. And literally, the argument is, they were just not different enough. I think it would have been very different if the 5-inch 54 had been ready earlier. If the 5-inch 54 had been ready earlier and they'd been able to be armed with 5-inch 54s, I think it'd be a very different circumstance. I think, honestly, if you'd had a situation where we can't fit the 5-inch 54s on a suitable mount, a suitable weapon, a sort of turret, onto the destroyers, we can onto the Atlantas, and we can build them, it would have been a very different scenario. And there is, of course, the Worcester class. There was a further of 10 of them planned and 2 actually completed, and they are, to an extent, a continuation of the idea of the Atlantas, but they are 6-inch armed vessels. They are 6-inch armed vessels. And again, whilst they have an aerial anti-air capability, and they have a very considerable anti-aircraft capability, and they are good ships, they are getting even further up we're building a screening cruiser, and it's a 6-inch screening cruiser. It is a 6-inch screening cruiser, more than being an AA cruiser. And I know, again, they get marketed as AA cruisers. I love this thing. People look at it and go, well, the emerging threat is aircraft, and so these vessels must be AA cruisers. But they're not. They're screening cruisers. They're supposed to engage light forces. And that's the thing about the Atlanta again. It doesn't bring overmatch to those light forces. It isn't going to be able to sweep the enemy destroyers. It's going to have to fight the enemy destroyers. And the reason for that is a very sensible reason on behalf of the US Navy. They're not prepared to tolerate the sheer number of attempts the Royal Navy have had at generating a general-purpose gun. They really aren't. They've tried to keep it as stock and as sensible as possible. And I love the US Navy for it. But this means that then when you're picking something which is the gun for your cruiser in this scenario, unless the 5-inch 54 was available, you haven't got any other options. The British had an option because they have attempted between 3 and 5.5 times, depending on how you are, to have a general-purpose, truly dual-purpose general-purpose gun system, universal gun system, for their destroyer and cruiser formations, and their secondaries on their capital ships. They have generally tried to do it. In between 1920 and 1939, between 3 and 5.5 times, depending on how you add it up. They've made the attempt. They've had the actual concerted effort. I know, they failed every time. The thing is, the amount of people who then turn around and go, well, they never attempt to do that, because look at all the different systems they have. No, the reason they have all those systems is because they attempt to do it. And the Americans, because they don't necessarily have the funding, but also because, honestly, you have officers like Admiral King who would look at you and go, why are you bringing in logistical complication for what we're dealing with? Why would you do that to me? That they don't have those options. So, yeah, the Atlanta class come from a very similar idea of a screening vessel, a vessel to support and enable destroyer formations, to really give them the firepower they need, and to also support fleet actions. But its weapon system, because of their own investment limitations, is not capable of doing that, and undermines its role as being a cruiser. And I know some people point to directors and they go, it needs more fire control, it needs more this. And they're not wrong. They're not wrong. But realistically, the really big problem with this design is that it's not got a 5-inch 54. It has not got a 5-inch 54. And the gun was first designed in 1940, and it wasn't available to 1945. And I think that tells you everything you need to know. Because when were these ordered? 1940. And I can guarantee you, if the 5-inch 54 had been further along development, had been available, it would have been fitted to the Atlanta class. And then we'd be talking differently about them. Honestly. There had probably been a whole storm of them produced during World War II. And successor designs. Things like the CL-154s, which was a design, realistically, if you look at them, which is far closer to being an AA cruiser and a screening cruiser than the Atlantas are. With up to 8 dual 5-inch 54s and up to 8 dual 3-inch 70s in its design. But that's a vessel planned in September 1945 in later World War II, and it was going to be roughly 12,000 tons. It is as different from the Atlanta class as you can be. But again, it makes sense. It does make sense. Such a firepower, such an asset makes sense in World War II and in the context of the early war especially. And then you have the C-class and D-class conversions. So this is the point at which normally people start bringing up, well, these were going to be ships were going to be got rid of once the Didos come into service. The Didos were going to replace them, or the Fijis were going to replace them. And realistically, they're not. There's two reasons for it, even if the treaty system continues long past 1937. One, once ships become overage, they don't count towards your treaty tonnage. It's a very interesting fact, but if you go and read the treaties, you find repeated emphasis made on things being overage. If they, for example, are a surface vessel exceeding 3,000 tons, but not exceeding 10,000 tons, and laid down before the 1st of January 1920, they're overage from 16 years. If they are laid down after the 31st of December 1919, they are 20 years old. They will be able to be replaced. They'll be overage at that point. And that's the point at which you can replace them. And that matters whilst there's a cumulative limit on the treaty tonnages. But if we consider the 1937 treaty, the later treaty, the one that's being negotiated when the Royal Navy is working through what it's going to do with the C-class vessels it still has, and working it out and deciding it, well, oh boy. That's when they have the option of, well, we can keep these things in service. We don't have to get rid of them, and they still work. And originally, they're armed with 6-inch guns. But you can modify them between 1938 and 1939 in the case of Cairo, Carlisle, and Calcutta to have 8 4-inch in 4 twin mounts. And 4 pom-pom guns in single mounts. They've got armor on their machinery spaces. They've got magazine. They've got deck armor. You know, they're perfectly useful vessels, capable of nearly doing 6,000 nautical miles at 10 knots after you've done some upgrades and repairs on them. And if you consider Coventry and Curlew, which were modified in 1936, they could have 10 4-inch guns in single mounts. 10 4-inch guns in single mounts, and 16 pom-poms in 2 octuple mounts. It's useful. It's useful. And Curacao, also modified in 1939, has 8 4-inch and again 4 twin mounts and 4 2-pounders. And this is the point again. This is what we have going on. These are older hulls. They are no longer useful as screening assets. That's what the like C-class, the D-class, the E-class were. They were screening cruisers. That's what the Town class were. They were scout and screening cruisers. There was their role in fleet operations, in fleet doctrine. Well, guess what? Now the threat is AA is coming in, and we've got convoys to escort, and we've got all sorts of forces which need extra additional capabilities added in. Well, these old cruisers, they still work. Their hulls are still good. Their single 6-inch guns and that arrangement, that's not useful. That doesn't help. But as a dedicated AA cruiser, it works. And arguably, therefore, it's the Cs and the Ds which are the dedicated AA cruisers in World War II. When you look at the Didos, when you look at the Atlantas, they are screening cruisers. These are screening cruisers which have been adapted to AA cruisers. They are conversions. And that's a really interesting thing when we think about it, because they're not the vessels you think about when you think about AA cruisers in World War II. They aren't. And yes, they had to have power supply upgrades and things so they could take radar, which was thought to be coming. And usually this meant they would drop some of their fuel capacity and some of their range. Officially, for example, the A conversions would go down to roughly 3,215 nautical miles at 12 knots, against their previous 5,900 nautical miles at 10 knots as range. And yeah, that is a drop, but honestly, again, things were found to be interesting when they wanted to be. And these vessels were critical to convoy escort. It's these vessels which in World War II were left with a convoy when Philip Vian charged across the Atlantic to engage the Bismarck. These are dedicated AA vessels. Their 4-inch guns provide rapid, heavy AA fire. Add in the plethora of pom-poms, the multiple target engagement capability with the various mounts. Yeah. These are your capable and AA conversions, your AA counter cruisers. And they fit tonnage-wise as well, as a specialist cruiser. They really do. But saying that, it's now time for the Shameless book plug. Now, just as the C's and D's conversions were not about making use of old ships, but also filling in the numbers of the fleet assets and allowing the Royal Navy to grow its strength, in the run-up to World War II and in the planning for World War II, so is it when you press the button down there and subscribe to this channel. This is a really interesting thing for me, okay? 90% of my viewers are repeat viewers, but only 50% of my viewers are subscribed. 90% of people like to watch multiples of my videos. And I find that fun in all sorts of ways, and strange in all sorts of ways. But it's a cool thing. It hopefully means I'm doing a fairly good job, or at least I'm doing as well as I can do and it's being appreciated. I don't know, but I would say if people are returning to watch my videos, that's a good thing. But what I worry about is if they aren't subscribed, and especially if they're, or even if they are subscribed but they haven't got that bell filled in, then they're only getting to watch the videos which YouTube thinks they're going to like, rather than getting to choose them themselves. Which means people can get siloed into one portion of content. and they don't get to see the wider naval history content. Now, maybe they'd only want that portion, but I think one of the joys of naval history is you can learn about so much, you can study so much. And when I think about upcoming Saturday videos about things like, Admiral Yi Sun Sin, and, well, again, the 40mm video, which will be coming out in a few weeks' time, and various other videos which are being packed in there, I find that a sad thing. And I know this video is about me saying thank you to you for supporting, for liking, sharing the channel, for watching the videos, for watching the adverts, for doing all the things which support the channel and help it be. And they are. But the reason I do the channel is not just the reason I even do the Shameless book plug. It's not just about promoting my book, but I am going to promote my book and other books which are coming. The reason I do this channel is because I want to get people as excited and interested in naval history as I am. And I want them to see the plethora of naval history that is out there. The fact is that because so much naval history takes place where people can't go and visit, where people can't go and think, I've got an afternoon off, I'll go for a wander around that battlefield, or I'll go for do that, which you can even do in Cornwall. There are battlefields and battle sites to go for wander around and go and have a look at. You can't do that with naval history. You can't. So, this is why I do this, because I want to spread the joy and knowledge of it. I want to spread the understanding of it. So yeah. Thank you for your support. Thank you for liking, sharing the channel. Thank you for watching videos again. But please, if you do that, please consider pressing that subscribe button and consider which of those bells you want to pick. Whether you want to have one which is completely filled in, so you see all my videos when they come out, or if you want to have one which is partially filled in. Because that stat, when I was reading it this month, because I had the monthly update, the analytics, and I finally got around to reading it, and I went, of your viewers, 90% are return viewers. Yes, 50% of viewers are subscribed. It doesn't tell me how many people have the bell filled in, and it doesn't tell me how many people have notifications turned on their phone. That's your personal data, and I'm not told that. But I can sort of work it out from the fact of what returns and how many people are watching some videos and how the videos go up and down in terms, especially the initial views. So yeah, it's your choice, but I think you'd enjoy it. I really think you would. Now, the Bay of Biscay is an often forgotten place in World War II, and it really shouldn't be. Because the Bay of Biscay is one of those areas where there is almost fighting every single day. But it's an ongoing low-level conflict, realistically, because there's never a big battle. There's never a massive clash between massive warships. You see cruiser engagements versus torpedo boats and destroyer fights and ongoing anti-submarine operations, because all of the Royal Navy convoys which are going down around Africa, which are going down to Gibraltar, all have to transit through the Bay of Biscay, as do all the submarines based in French ports from Germany, which are trying to get out to the North Atlantic. And you'd be amazed at all the aircraft flying from air bases in France that are also going out across the Bay of Biscay, whether to attack Britain, just patrol the sea, generally just do the duties they're required to. So it's a constant battle. It's a constant ongoing threat and engagement scenario. And that means it's somewhere where these cruisers get a lot of work. These cruisers get a lot of work. You often find C-class cruisers, you often find the conversions in this area escorting convoys, being put to hard work. You'll sometimes find Didos there. You'll sometimes find other vessels there. It's rather an interesting position for vessels to turn up and be providing air defence. There's no surprise that it's on the Biscay route which the first escort carriers, the first Woolworth carrier, when it's being tested out and being worked as a concept, is employed. people often look at me funny going, well, why not put it on North Atlantic route? Why not put it on the other routes? No, because the highest threat route, the route which they were most worried about, was the Bay of Biscay route. It's a bit which is often forgotten. It's folded into the Battle of the Atlantic, or it's folded... So for some reason, some authors fold it into the Battle of the Mediterranean. And whilst I can understand, to an extent, it being folded into Battle Atlantic, it really isn't about crossing the Atlantic. It's about going down the Atlantic. And it doesn't really neatly fit in that whole battlescape, because often the clashes are rather like the Mediterranean one, which I suppose is why it gets fitted in with the Mediterranean. Mediterranean, the whole issue is you've got convoys going backwards and forwards from the British, going east to west and west to east, and you've got Italian-led convoys for the Axis forces going north to south and south to north. Well, in this scenario, you have British convoys going north to south and south to north, and you have the Germans transiting their U-boats most often from east to west and west to east when they're returning. But that's it. And air attacks are constant. The Focke-Wulf Condors and other aircraft are a constant threat in this environment. And the heavy AA cruisers are often a key part of deterring that, because if you think about it, the whole British doctrine of air defence at sea was, if you're in a fleet engagement, or if you're dealing with large amounts of land-based aircraft coming in large numbers, you have an aircraft carrier. Its fighters will break up the enemy airstrike further away. Then, once, if they're coming in a solid 50, 60 aircraft, they get broken up into 4s and 6s, and, by fighters diving into them and basically causing them to split apart. And then the heavy AA breaks them up further. Breaks them up into the 1s and 2s, which then the medium AA, the 40mm, starts really blasting away at them to try and give them a really rocketing time. Everything to try and work down their nerves, because they've been coming in as a group feeling all brass, all lovely, oh, look at us, we're all off to kill the enemy, yeah, we're going to do it. And then you're just down to you and your mate and going, don't worry, we're together, man, we'll make it through, and then you're all alone, flying with explosions going off around you, and pops going off around you, and your wing having damage, and all this shrapnel going on around you, and all the morale that effect that has on you. Well, if you don't have a carrier, that's a problem. But if you're not facing large strikes, just 1s and 2s of aircraft, or 3s and 4s usually, at most, suddenly that heavy AA, it has the same role as the fighters. It's about putting up a dense enough firepower, dense enough explosions to break that smaller group up, because they're already in the smaller chunk. They're already in the group which is manageable by heavy AA to break it up, and it works. It works. Go and have a look at the results of the Bay of Biscay. There are lots of fights with aircraft. There are very few losses in comparison. Now, I know someone's going to go through and go, well, this ship was lost, this ship was lost, this ship was lost. And they were. But again, the defenders have to be lucky every time. The attackers only have to be lucky once. People remember the scores of the attackers in terms of the number of wins. They don't remember the number of times they come along, they score nothing. They don't remember the number of times they come in, they try to get a near miss. And if you want a good example, read any book about World War II. Read about it in the fleet defences of these operations. The times when the enemy miss or they're forced off, if they are mentioned, get maybe 1 or 2 sentences. That's all. The times when they hit will get whole pages discussing damage. And this gives you the false impression that the successes are more common than they actually are. This is not to say they don't happen. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that discussing the failure to hit doesn't really sell books. Speaking as someone who has written a naval history book, I would love to have... I'm guilty of that as well. The attacks which didn't work don't get much of a coverage. Because honestly, there isn't much to write about. The system worked. Excellent. Carry on. What people want to read about normally in the books is when the system doesn't work, and so that's when you have to give all the details and explain it all in full and forthright detail. And so that takes up far more of the book, and so that becomes, by dint of volume, of words taken up, the far more understood thing. The necessary to point that that's the rarity. It got through. It caused damage. And we go on to the Mediterranean fleet. Now this, believe it or not, is a theatre where screening is most important. And where the Didos, oh my lord, do the Didos come of age. They take part in almost every major operation. When they're available, they're there. They're fighting. They're doing their duty. Because realistically, this is the kind of war they were built for. If you look at it in terms of British fleet doctrine and British fleet preparedness prior to World War II, where honestly their fleet exercises were more, right then, we brought the home fleet, or the Atlantic fleet, it changes its name almost every other year, into the Mediterranean. We are in this corner, here is a page of scenario, ding 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 bell, engage. Do we have a referee? No, kill each other. That's their war exercises. That's the crucible through which a lot of their ideas have come from. And this is why I can say, the British are very weird in that they're the only fleet which actually has an actual exercise scenario they exercised for actually come about, and that is the Battle of Matapan. Literally is as they've exercised it, barring they get cruisers rather than an enemy capital ship. But life happens. Sometimes you don't get all you want. They were hoping to get a capital ship because that would cause the whole fleet to slow down, and then they could engage and kill them at night and do all those things. But it went pretty much as it was planned to. They're the only ones who get multiple scenarios which turn out to be close to their pre-war exercises, and that's literally because of the methodology they've gone to. But it's calling them exercises and scenarios that I sometimes find difficult, because I actually do. Having spent as much time with them in the archives and have spent much time talking to people who took part in them as I have, I know they were literally, as I said, here is a one-page, maybe even half a page, especially once you add in the fact there's people's names and various things, and people have to sign it, etc. Half a page description of the scenario, and it's ding, 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 fighters to your corners, engage. That I'm not really sure it counts under those scenarios. But leaving that to one side, this is where the Didos really do come into their own, and really do show their utility. They are able to fight with especially with some of the lighter light cruisers that they find themselves up against the Axis forces. And honestly, I do think if these vessels had found themselves fighting a German light cruiser, they'd have probably won the battle. Because let's be honest, the German light cruisers were terrible. They were really... They had so many good ideas as options, but they just... Too many committees, too many people, too many different... wanting to shoehorn their idea in, it ruins the design. That was the problem with the German light cruisers, but that's not today's discussion. There's a reason the German light cruisers aren't here in this discussion. The Didos, principally, in these operations, were being used as screening forces. Sometimes they were being used as solo, sometimes they were being used as part of cruiser formations when cruisers were out. They were literally there to provide them with, oh, well, if the enemy tries to do a torpedo boat run, Didos, engage. Oh, goody. Aircraft are coming in, Didos, engage. Enemy light forces are coming, we can engage them. And the thing is, the 5.25 is a really interesting weapon because it's just powerful enough. The 133mm gun is just powerful enough they can start to edge out, because its effective firing range at 45 degrees angle with a high explosive shell is 23,400 yards, or 21.4 kilometers. Maximum firing range is a little bit further than that. Maximum firing range is a little bit further than that. And whilst, yes, the 6-inch gun does have a slightly longer range, it can reach, at the same angle of elevation, 25,500 yards, or 23 kilometers. It has a similar effective range. And it's the same with the 8-inch gun, if we consider under its, especially when it was under visual aiming and visual targeting. When you consider the likely engagement ranges the British considered for cruiser fights was between 18 and 21,000 yards. Well, the 5.25 starts to match in. But the trouble is, its effective ranges, it's the actual engagement ranges, it's what they can provide, that's what matters. And again, it's against quite lightly armed light cruisers. They're more effective. If it's a heavy cruiser, they'll do some damage, but again, it's not a lot. It's going to be more of a mission kill for torpedo time. And again, they can achieve a 7 to 8 round per minute sustained fire, which again is very good, because with the 6-inch guns, that's slightly faster again. That's slightly faster than what they can achieve. They're 6 to 8 rounds a minute. Usually it's 6. All these things add up. And so they get involved in the battles. In the Battle of Sirte and various other operations, they are critical assets. And the second Battle of Sirte, which this picture is from, when Philip Vian leads 4 light cruisers, an AA cruiser, which is, by the way, HMS Carlisle. That's the only one designated as an AA cruiser, a converted C-class. And a whole bunch of destroyers and submarines. Unfortunately, only HMS Seek was there, and HMS Zulu to represent the tribals. So, not enough tribals really for Philip Vian's taste, but he has 3 of his light cruisers. 3. Dido, Cleopatra, and Ulysses are all Didos. His only light cruiser, which is a 6-inch cruiser, is Penelope. And with these forces, he holds off a battleship, 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, 10 destroyers. He holds off these forces. Yes, he has light cruisers damaged. Yes, he has destroyers disabled. Yes, he has 3 more destroyers damaged. But he damages the battleship, and he holds them off. And he doesn't lose ships. He has 39 men killed in a scenario which should have been a walkover. It should have been a walkover. But his screening forces, his cruisers, which are screening cruisers, are able to screen their convoy and get everything through. Or rather, get everything through the battle and going away from the battle. Yes, the British don't get the convoy to where they wanted to get. So it's not realistically a British success. But it's a success for the Didos, it's a success for the fleet handling, it's a success that they aren't annihilated. The fact it's even a disputed battle, it's lost because they don't achieve their aims, but the fact that it's even a disputed result, that it's not a walkover, is down to the quality of the ships the British are able to deploy and the crews in them. The battleship is the Littorio. It's not a bad ship, it's a very good battleship. As I've said before, Littorios, pound for pound, are probably the best Axis battleships in World War II. And the heavy cruisers are the Gorzio and Trento. And there's also the Giovanni del Bandenea, a Gassanio class. Against this force they hold. Air attacks later on, well, that they do manage to lose against, because they literally are overwhelmed. That is where the merchant ships are lost from that convoy. They're lost to air attack. It's like the Italians lose ships afterwards, sunk by storm after the action. I'm fairly sure the damage received during the battle was probably a contributing factor to it, at least in some regards, but yeah. In the surface action, they were held off. The Italians were held off, and they were held off by screening assets. And that leads us to the Indian Ocean, where, well, in this scenario, the Didos get an even more interesting scenario, and it's something which was never really accorded to the Atlantas. In this section, the Didos are used as command ships. When working with escort carriers, aka Woolworth carriers, acting in their strike carrier role and facilitating support for forces fighting in Southeast Asia, i.e. the 8th Army and Bill Slim, well, the Royal Navy tended to adopt a policy of you can either have a pair of Didos or a Dido and a tribal class destroyer with your escorts, okay, escort carriers. Why? They're your command ships. They have command facilities, they have space for a staff. The escort carriers really don't, and with them there, you have enough firepower that if anyone tries to, of the light forces which are in the area, really try to make a run for the escort carriers, they're going to be faced with a decent amount of firepower to try and deter them. Which is ultimately what they're for. That's what these ships are about. These ships are about supporting fleet operations. And honestly, running a fleet operation, a light fleet operation, is right up their street. You don't need anything heavier for these operations. You don't need anything more powerful than this. What you will note, though, is that as radar has become more prevalent, that's one of the reasons why they can drop down to 4 guns forward. And one of the reasons why the designs start to change and they've got more AA, sometimes they have 4-inch guns and all sorts of things added in to that C position. Because honestly, once you've got radar-guided gunnery, you don't need, for the ranging shots, 6 guns firing forward. So it makes more sense to use that top weight for other things, to broaden your capabilities. Pom-poms, quad pom-poms, are especially light. Why? Because they provide a goodly rate of fire and goodly engagement for anything which gets through the 5.25 inch, and then you want to provide a more rounded capability, especially in the AA scenario. I'd argue that's probably the weakness of the Didos in the Mediterranean, and a general weakness which was commented throughout the war was that they'd only been fitted with quad mounts, and octuple mounts especially were in demand. It's one of those interesting things. There's some ideas put forward at various points. There is not a design I've seen in the actual archives in Q. I have to say that, not in Greenwich either. But I've seen discussions and points around them where there was honestly a chance that these vessels would come in with twin 5.25 inch mounts and 4 octuple pom-pom mounts. 2 on the sort of at the waist wing, waist wing positions, and 1 in a C position, and 1 in a X position when you've got Y and Z as your main turrets. And that's an interesting idea. Very interesting idea. It would have made them for very, very scary assets in so many ways. But again, the thing is, these are screening assets, and that would have made them quite obviously an AA asset. And that's the problem. Because whilst, yes, you give them a stronger AA capability, you would reduce their capability vis-a-vis destroyers and torpedo boats. And if you're the Royal Navy, in thinking about this in 1939, destroyers and torpedo boats are just as big a threat, and they are as big a threat throughout the war. But the thing is, they're a threat which gets more managed as you get things like the Hunt class coming into service, and you get whole the fleets of war emergency destroyers coming into service. So again, it makes more sense to make these modifications to your cruisers as time goes on, when you have that growth in other forces. And it's worthwhile thinking back into the Bay of Biscay and the fights which are going on there. In the run-up to D-Day, well, Black Prince is getting into all sorts of operations because she is supporting the 10th Destroyer Flotilla. So every one of the battles they go into, they have this thing backing them up. And there was a really interesting discussion I read a few years ago, which was, if the earlier version of the Dido was ordered and they were available, what happens if one of these is sent in, one of those sort of Didos is sent in rather than Warspite to back up a Narvik? Would it have been more effective? It was an interesting paper to read as an analysis. I don't know if my friend ever published it. It's something which I should probably get him to come on and talk about. But realistically, my view was always, why is it an either-or scenario? If you have one of these available, and you have the spare cruisers that them being available would mean, why not take one in with Warspite? Because you might as well. As it is, most of our support for the 10th Flotilla was providing star shell and making sure the theatre was suitably illuminated for them to carry out their operations. But if they'd been pressed, if the Germans had brought enough resources and had started being able to push them back, or actually look like they were in danger of meeting them fairly, let alone overwhelming, meeting them fairly, then she would have been very close, with a lot of firepower, very quickly reining it in. The thing is, again, a lot of 5.25-inch guns on a hull which can sustain and support them and deal with the recoil and the effect of their fire. That's useful. That's a capability. That's worthwhile having. She's got the reach. She's got the different firepower capabilities than the destroyers, that it's worthwhile having her there as backup to destroyers instead of just having more destroyers. It's worthwhile having her there. And that realistically is the differential. It's the utility of having them. But, of course, after D-Day and after those operations have been taking place, and frankly after the naval war in Europe was pretty much over, of course these vessels all start streaming out to the Pacific, where they're greeted in a kind of interesting manner by the Americans, because the American experience with their equivalents has been less blessed. Now, this is coming from someone who has, in many videos in the past, and will still say this, I don't actually like the Didos. The reason I don't like them is because they're cruisers, but they're not able to do really the diplomacy and the role of cruisers that you expect of cruisers. They are destroyer-built cruisers, where they are crammed and everything with weapons, and everything is based around their weapon systems, rather than destroyer, which is what destroyers are. And for an asset the size of a cruiser, I will always therefore prefer an Aerofuser as a cruiser. But a Dido is still a very useful asset. And even I have to concede that whilst I don't like them, they're useful. Whilst I would have probably gone with a slightly different design, and I'd probably gone with something which had at least 3 octuple mounts on it, and slightly bigger. Not much bigger, but 3 octuple pom-pom mounts and slightly bigger, so maybe 2 roughly waist on the wings and 1 in that X position above the last 2 turrets. On the stern would be my firepower. That's me. That's me being picky. And I know it's me being picky. It's me wanting to make them better because, frankly, they should be. But again, the Americans, when they saw the British bring them in, were going, but this hasn't been that useful. And the differential again is the 5.25 versus the 5, realistically. The 5-inch 38 is a great destroyer weapon. It's not a great cruiser one. Now, to be fair, some of this might come from the fact that they also have quad 1.1 guns, usually 3 as initially built, but 4 often later on. However, their early service and their early history and how they fought in the battles showed the weakness of them. They are billed as cruisers. They are billed as cruisers. And when Atlanta participates in the Battle of Midway, she does well. They do well. But then she receives heavy gunfire damage and eventually a torpedo hit from various surface vessels and is sunk during the Battle of Guadalcanal because she's a cruiser. She has a cruiser silhouette, she has a cruiser function, and she doesn't have weaponry which will allow her to do both. She has a dual-purpose weapon, which is a destroyer weapon. And as good as it is, and this is one of the strange things you get into, the 5-inch 38 is one of the standout dual-purpose weapons of World War II, unashamedly. But it is not the firepower you need for a cruiser. The 5-inch 54, anything would have been a better weapon system virtually for this vessel because of its size. It's a bigger target. It needs to be able to therefore reach out further because it can be seen from further away. And because it looks like a cruiser, not a destroyer, people are going to engage it as a cruiser, not a destroyer. And that is the problem. That is the problem. Juno, in the same battle, in Guadalcanal, is damaged in surface combat and then has a run-in with I-26 where she gets sunk. It doesn't automatically follow that they get torpedoed and they get lost. It's often a cumulative damage, and that shows their quality of their construction. But Reno's torpedoed off Leyte in the 4th of November 1944, and she's saved by damage control. By very, very good damage control. They are all paid off into the reserve fleet after World War II, and all of them are just never activated, never brought back into service. They are just struck and scrapped by 1970. And realistically, it's to an extent the legacy of Guadalcanal, where they were sent into a battle they weren't prepared for. But it's also a legacy of the design decisions made. The Atlantas don't get put in a scenario where they can really perform to their best. The horde of destroyers come in later on in the war, so they don't get to lead a horde of destroyers in Guadalcanal. That's what they should have been doing, diving about with the destroyers, being naughty with the destroyers, maneuvering with the destroyers, being a big destroyer. And what's worse is this suffering in this surface action means people forget that before the surface action, which cost them, it was basically Atlanta and Juno which absolutely blasted an attack by Betis and other Japanese aircraft so that they didn't overwhelm their formation. They screened the fleet against the air attack. Those two ships led the defense, led the security of their force. Atlanta, whilst we say is sunk by surface ships, let's be honest, she gets torpedoed by the Japanese and then hit by 19 8-inch shells from San Francisco. The Americans doing a blue on blue in a night fight. Unfortunately, in Guadalcanal, it's kind of par for the course. Atlanta didn't return fire because the gun flashes of San Francisco revealed that she was not Japanese. Not Japanese. In the end, though, still, she was scuttled by them because there wasn't salvageable facilities available, and so it wasn't viable for her. It was not a viable option for her. Juno, well, Juno. She's hit first by a torpedo from the Amatsukaze. Sorry. And then later on, 2 more from I-26. She's the ship of which the 5 Sullivan brothers, of which the USS the Sullivans is named for, go down with. Which is a sad sail. But it's a good destroyer. It's a good destroyer. But still, the point remains. For ships which get a legacy and a reputation of being a bit weak, one's hit by 3 torpedoes, the other one's hit by a torpedo and 19 8-inch shells at close range. I know, the San Francisco usually says we were firing at a Japanese silhouette behind you, but check your fire. That might work as an excuse, as a reasoning, but it's still a bit hollow. And yes, it's a night fight, it's confused. But the losses of these 2 ships early in their career, and the reality of them not offering a significant advantage over the destroyer brethren, is what fundamentally undermines them as a program. That's the reason the Atlantas don't get built more and don't get used more. And that's a real shame when you do consider their performance in air defensive formations. It should have been that for every single Essex the US Navy churned out, there was at least 2 of these sitting with it. There should have been that. I honestly and will always fervently believe that if you'd had a couple of Atlantas with every single Essex as it was churned out, the US Navy would have suffered a lot less, especially when it came to kamikaze time, because of the sheer amount of fire they could put up as the close escorts. Instead, you have battleships playing close escort, and most of the battleships which are able to do it are not the fast ones. Yes, they can carry a lot of firepower. Yes, they can take a lot of hits. But they can't do the 32.5 knots. They can't keep up with the carriers if they're fully maneuvering. So you either have to limit the carrier's maneuver options, or you have to do some really weird stuff. It's just not a good situation. These are what you needed for that. These are what you needed for that operation. And should have had them. And would have had them, probably, if instead of being used as another one of the cruisers, someone had thought, hang on, these are destroyers. They're large destroyers, but they're destroyers. Because that's what they were. That's what this design, that's what all their weaponry screams to you. When you look at it, they're the only American cruisers to pack torpedoes. They're the only American cruisers with these 5-inch 38s as their primary armaments. They're, all these things, they are overgrown, overblown destroyers. That doesn't make them unuseful. It just means you have to treat them as that. And act with them as that. And probably put captains in them who are destroyer officers more than anything else. Which leads us to the final question of were they all worth it? Were these ships, the C-class and D-class conversions, the Atlantas with their storied history, and the Didos, were they worth it? Well, for the answer to that question, I point you to the Tigers, I point you to the Worcester class, I point you to the fact that the cruisers which come after them have a heavy AA capability in their weaponry, in first their guns and later on their missiles. It's made a function, it's a very expensive function to add in, but it's made a critical function of their heavy guns, of their 6-inch guns especially, that they will have a high degree of AA capability. So whilst, no, they are not specialist air defence cruisers, that's not their role. They are air defence capable cruisers as part of their duties. I'd argue myself the Tiger class, more than the Worcesters, are really the last generation of screening cruisers built by any navy. And I would argue that based on their firepower, because if they were more than screening cruisers, they would have had more than 4 6-inch guns and 8 3-inch guns. They would have had at least 6 6-inch guns. You have to at least, if you're going to be using them more than just as screening assets, they need to have more firepower. They need to be on a par with an Aerofuser class at the very least. But they're screening cruisers. They've got the 6-inch guns to deal with surface threats and air threats at longer range, and they've got the 3-inch guns to shred anything which gets to closer. The Worcesters, well, they're laid down in 1945. They're not launched till 1947 and commissioned in 1948 and 49. They serve roughly a decade for the US Navy. And they're useful vessels. Worcester and Roanoke, they're useful vessels. They're 6-inch guns. They're 12 6-inch guns in 6 twin mounts. Is a lot of firepower. And to me, they are a sensible version of the Atlantas because they now have more, their guns are more powerful than those you see on other ships, on smaller ships. So they are cruiser guns. But they've got the firepower, the breadth of it, they can use it for the AA. They can put up a blistering, an absolutely blistering flak wall if they need to. They can engage. I would argue also carrying roughly 24 3-inch 50 AA guns in twin and single mounts is also pretty useful. They are again something which is going to put up a huge amount of firepower. This is a screening vessel. I would argue this is a picket vessel. This is a vessel which is built within the fleet to provide it with screening strength and to help it with managing external threats from various lighter forces. This is something which could be a picket on its own, with enough firepower that anything wants to get past it, it's going to be considering a different option in life. Strongly. But only 2 of them are made. And one of the reasons is because they already have a huge number of cruisers available that, yeah, might not be as orientated around the mission, but they're available and you don't have to pay for new ones. There's also the very real reality that this is in many ways becoming almost too specialized. And I do hate to say this, especially considering what I've said about the 5-inch 38, but the 6-inch 47 in these particular mounts had issues. It did have issues. They were pushing it as hard as they could. They were trying to make it as capable as they could. And that complexity meant there were issues with the reliability. But still, useful ships. Now, this is the point, though, I was going to make. And the question I'm going to ask. I want you to think about all we've discussed about screening ships. What would a modern screening ship look like? are any navies building modern screening ships? I'd really be interested in knowing what you're going to say and hearing what you're going to say, because we talk about escorts these days, we don't talk about screening. We talk about fleet formations, we don't talk about the different layers in that fleet as much as we used to. And one of those reasons is because we have shrunk the forces down as much as we have and have hollowed them out as much as we have. That is true. But you still need to have the conversation and work out how the ships are going to be. With that being said, what have we got coming up? Well, this week we have both Tsushima and Jutland on Tuesday and Wednesday, and I will record them on Saturday this week. I'll record them on Saturday because I think everyone's going out the house, so it's going to be me and the poodle left. So, might as well do some recording. The only DIY projects work I have left is using the circular saw, and I don't like to use that when I'm the only one in the house, because whilst I'm touch wood sensible with it and careful with it, I like that it's a quite a potent system, and I'd rather have someone here, even if it's just to do a phone call. Anyway. Thank you very much, everyone. And by the way, that's a bit of a safety advice, which is my grandfather passed on to me, and I stick to. And I said, touch wood, I'll always be good, and touch wood, always be sensible. But when you're using heavy-duty power tools and systems which can do quite a lot of damage very quickly if you have an accident or if something just goes weird or wrong, make sure you have someone else in the house with you. Make sure you have someone who is listening out if you are screaming. So not just in your house, but preferably without headphones on, so they can hear you. We don't want to be in that situation. You never want to be in that situation. But please, think about it. Thank you very much. And also, while this video will go out on the Saturday, and therefore I will add in that on the Saturday, the suggestions are still live for August 2025 patron suggestions. If you want to go and make a suggestion for topics to be voted on, you have to get them in today on Saturday, because the vote's going to start on the Sunday. So you don't have that long. Thank you very much for watching, and take care.